Hi there. The May the 4th movement was a turning point for China, ushering in a new cultural movement, a fresh thought, and an expansion of knowledge, and ultimately gave birth to a new nation. So 100 years on, what does this movement mean for today's China? How does the legacy of May the 4th shape Chinese political attitude towards the West? And how are youth today carrying the torch from the pioneering students a century ago? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Shan Bin from the School of Journalism and Communication at Tsinghua University and Professor Jiang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to our discussion here. The events of May the 4th movement would prove a decisive turning point in China's living memory and history about who we are. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the movement. That's indeed very important for us to reflect upon how and why we went through a century of reflection, vicissitudes in our search for national identity, and particularly with regard of how we should aspire to learn from the West from that turning point. What do you make of the message that this 100th anniversary delivers?
I think one important aspect is that the May 4th movement actually represents the beginning of quest for Chinese modernity, because I think the modernization become a very important theme of the 20th century China. And the other aspect, I think, other than national identity, it is also a very important moment for Chinese intellectuals to redefine their own identity. So particularly the Western thought that individuality and also democracy, science, this new concept was imported to the intellectual discourse to reshape Chinese intellectual thought.
Now, I'd like to invite Professor Jiang to brief our Western audience about the history, the historical background against which this movement took place, because you don't I mean, the Westerners, they don't care about the May the 4th movement, but we take it so seriously today.
Yeah, well, it happened at the end of the First World War. China as a victor in that war. Actually, China participated in that war through sending support and also personnel to Europe, fighting with the Allies. So China ended up with a victor of the First World War, but at the Versailles Treaty, China was treated very badly. And particularly with one aspect of transferring the concessions that Germany occupied at that time to Japan. And that just, when the news came back to Beijing, it just, stirred a national outrage. So I think if you, put yourself in the shoes of an intellectual or student in 1999, your feeling towards the West is actually very complex. On one side, you're extremely disappointed, right? I mean, to the extent being outraged of how China was being treated at the time by the West, particularly by Britain and by France at the time. The United States actually was quite benign. It was promoting the self-determination by President Woodrow Wilson. So on one side, China students were very angry with the West. But the other side, I think it opened the door to looking at the West, how democracy, what we call here today, Mr. Democracy, Mr. Science, have been able to lead the West, and how Chinese people have discovered that China's been lagging behind in these aspects, and they started to think about these new philosophies from the West. And I think it marks the beginning of an influx of Western thoughts into China, particularly these leftists' thoughts, Marxism, for example. And I think the birth of Communist Party in China was very much attributed to that movement. Most of the intellectuals in the 1919s and 1920s were very much on the left side. And I think that itself caused a profound impact on the rest of the Chinese history. And we know what happened after that.
President Xi Jinping delivered a keynote presentation to mark the 100th anniversary of this Youth Day, or May the 4th movement. He emphasized the importance of being patriotic. What does that mean?
I think the official discourse of patriotism and also nationalism, as Professor Guo just talked about, is that China is involved in endeavor of redefine its position in the world system. So I think at this point, particularly right now, when China transcends from regional power to global power, I think this kind of the quest for right position in the world system is also very important for us to understand this May 4th tradition, and how China really situated in this new world system to actually contribute more thought and more value to the whole world.
Yeah, I mean, patriotism is one of the themes during that movement, because China was treated badly, and the students were fighting. I mean, we have a slogan at the time that, fighting for our own rights externally and penalize those traitors internally, right? Something like that.
There's no question about this issue of national pride in a period when China was humiliated by the bad treatment at the Versailles
Treaty.
By the Versailles Treaty and the Paris Peace Conference.
Right.
But let's look at the issue in the present-day context. Now, since Mr. Xi Jinping took office, he raised the idea of a national rejuvenation, and China is getting so close to the center stage of world politics and world economics. At this moment, China and the general public is quite divided along the spectrum of opinions about the three major schools of thought. One is Confucianism, the other Marxism, and the third is, of course, liberalism, or individual liberty, liberal democracy, liberal market economy. Since our entry into the WTO, this kind of noise from the liberals in China are getting louder and louder. Now, what do you think of the mixed feelings that characterize how Chinese intellectuals and policymakers look at the future of China?
I think the one important thing is that when we talk about May 1st movement, particularly in 1980s, May 1st movement was defined as a symbol of the quest for Western modernity. But on the other hand, we have to realize that I think, especially since 2016, when we actually entered a post-West era, I think Chinese intellectuals also doubt about the validity of this Western modernity. So this is a right moment for us to rethink the idea of Chinese modernity by integrating what you just referred, liberalism, Marxism, and Confucianism, whether they can reconcile. They do not have to contest with each other or even fight each other, but there should be a kind of what we call the reconciliation of these three traditions. So this is particularly the core of Chinese modernity that we have to think about.
John, 8 years ahead of the May the 4th movement, we had the founding of the Republic of China. That's the first republic in Asia in those days. Do you think the students and student leaders of this May the 4th movement must have drawn inspirations from Dr. Sun Yat-sen's leadership and his ideas about the future of China since the end of the Qing dynasty?
Yes, absolutely. I think Mr. Sun Yat-sen's banner was very much, taking good elements from the Western culture, at the same time championing a very patriotic or nationalistic banner. I mean, the party itself is called the Nationalist Party of China. So I think this combination rejuvenates a lot of people, and they encourage a lot of people, inspired a lot of people. And he was quite successful. I mean, he got very popular at the time. And I think, looking back, even today, I think, you mentioned these three schools of thoughts, and I think the situation hasn't really changed too much. I mean, I think on one side, we tend to still have to be recognizant of the fact that China is still not quite the center of the world stage yet. I mean, we still have a gap there. We still haven't, taken over the United States being the largest economy in the world and being dominant in the world. No, we're far from that, in my opinion. But on the other hand, I think it's also absolutely wrong to be totally hostile towards Western thoughts, towards Western sort of liberal thoughts,
But excuse me, John, a senior professor from People's University of China wrote an article about the nature of the current confrontation between the United States and China. He said it's actually a fight for leadership between the Christian civilization and Confucian civilization. He says in the article that even Russia could get a little bit closer to the West because Orthodox is, after all, something that they deviated from Christian culture. But Confucianism is radically different in many ways from what the West stands for. I mean, constitution, individual liberties, so on and so forth. Do you think Confucianism has somehow been revised by the Communist Party to suit the national conditions and to consolidate the power of Marxism and Leninism, something that we learned from the former Soviet Union. But the Russians themselves have somehow denied their relevance for Stalinism and Leninism.
What you just mentioned actually remind us of the, I think, well-known metaphor that Harvard professor Samuel Huntington has mentioned, the clashes of civilization. So, but I think what we try to prove today, especially the Belt and Road Initiative included, is to present what I call a global China image, in that we can actually harbor all different philosophies, including Marxism, Confucianism, and also liberalism, to a new way that how we actually find our own road, which I call it Chinese modernity. So what I would emphasize is, in 1980s, when we remembered or we kind of reflect May 4th tradition, we would emphasize what the kind of westernization aspect. There is still, I remember in 1998, a CGTN aired a documentary called River Elegy, which is very similar to the May 4th intellectuals' denial of Chinese tradition. But I think up today, when we enter into a stage of global China, I think this kind of very, I call it the binary dichotomy, or a kind of duality thinking should be denied, because we need to use more dialectical and integrative thinking to try to think what kind of tradition really apply to Chinese realities.
You know, I totally reject this idea of fighting between civilizations. You know, it's a myth. I mean, it doesn't exist.
You don't think there's such a thing like a civilization clashes?
No, I don't believe in that. First of all, I don't think our government is in a position, takes the position that we are not even competing with the American side. I mean, we think we have a notion of community of shared future. The very notion of Confucianism itself doesn't emphasize about fighting. It talks about harmonization, talks about trying to work with the world system to be integrated into the world order. And I don't think this concept of you know, this fighting for dominance has any future. This is a 19th century strategy of looking for a 21st century problem. It doesn't work out. Right now, you know, even in the United States right now, under the Pompeo's administration, Pompeo's State Department, there's a lady by the name of, you know this, right, Karen Skinner, I'm sorry. He doesn't even emphasize the civilizational fight. He was talking about fighting based on racial dichotomy. I mean, this is just crazy. You know, I think it's this idea. I mean, this kind of idea of fighting among civilizations doesn't belong here. I don't think
the issue of racial discrimination aside at this moment, but the voice of a very outspoken liberals in China argue strongly that what the West stands for centuries is the importance of rule of law, which goes against the importance of central authorities of a central kingdom. Like Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, founding father of Singapore, said, majority of the Chinese feel very comfortable with having a strong central government. Now, from the Western perspective, this goes against the rule of law, whose spirit emphasizes the necessity of respecting equality in the market economy to encourage a laissez-faire competition. Therefore, that's why the status of SOE is questioned very much by the American delegation in the current tweet talk. You can raise a number of examples to illustrate the sea differences between the West and the East. Now, our discussion somehow focuses on the importance of rule of law. Do you think the rule of law will be an important part of what we call the clashes of civilization? John says there's no such a thing like a clashes of civilization. Professor Samuel Huntington is wrong.
I would still think that, including when we reflect May 4th tradition, this kind of total rejection of traditional Chinese culture is a kind of legacy we have to rethink. Because I think in recent years, there is a kind of revival of the traditional Chinese culture. So having said that, again, I go back to my earlier point. I think we do not have to follow the tradition of May 4th lectures that we try to dichotomize East and West, tradition, modernity, China, and the West. I think this kind of thinking has to be changed to a more dialectical thinking, that this kind of tradition can shouldn't be reconciled in Chinese, in the mode of Chinese modernity. Actually, what China has followed in the past few years is that we have our own so-called Chinese model or Chinese own road. So this is already a kind of reflection of Mayfair tradition.
I've been talking to so many politicians and scholars, policymakers from around the world, particularly those from the West, and these guys from the West argue, look, Yang, you cannot say that this is a capitalism with Chinese characteristics. When we talk about democracy, for example, it's characterized with just a few simple hallmarks. Independence of the media, independence of the judiciary, and checks and balances in the parliament, so on and so forth. But in China, it seems, given the holistic picture about being inclusive, it means knowledge, everything, something of everything instead of everything of something. So this makes sense in the Chinese context. But for the West, they think enough is enough. We don't carry on our coexistence on your terms. We must look at the issue of globalization on our terms.
Well, my position is that we can still coexist based on differences. We can agree to disagree. We can each carry our own system. I mean, the United States call it competition, and I don't even call it competition. We don't actively promote our model. We don't mind sharing our model, and we do our own things. As long as our country, is doing well, as our country is advancing, as our country is, economic growth is taking place. What's wrong with, we're not fighting for sort of what's called like a sphere of influences or geopolitical interests. I mean, as I said, that's a game belonging to the 19th centuries. We're in a different
Gentlemen,
world.
we can talk for hours and hours about the differences of cultural, economic, political between the West and China, which is somehow a very powerful symbol to ensure consistency of a civilization state. Now, Mr. Xi Jinping emphasized the importance of looking after or being caring for the young people in an age when a lot of them want to run their startup companies. They have a lot to do to care for the elderly because China is getting old before we get rich, and they have to face the immediate concern of being made redundant in this year alone, because up to 8 million would have to graduate from universities, and the government would only fix, 10 million jobs, and that's a lot. It's a huge challenge for the government and for those who might be found jobless. So what do you think of the role the government could play at a time of economic downward spiraling? I mean, this is a huge challenge for the stability of the government.
Yeah, well, I think the bottom line is still economic development. I mean, the government doesn't create jobs. I mean, the government provides an environment where business thrive that creates jobs. So I think what the current administration is doing, I think it's on the right track in terms of reducing taxes, for example, opening up markets, making small, medium-sized business more available to have access to credit. These measures help to create an environment where business can thrive. And granted, we're facing a headwind right now. I mean, the world economy is reportedly heading towards a recession, and it's a very difficult time. On top of this, we have this tensions with the United States on trade. But I think overall, as long as we keep on this track in terms of making a smaller government, having the market being the foundational role in terms of allocating resources towards market economy, moving towards market economy, I think this business will still, be successful and thrive, and jobs will just follow. I'm fully believing this theory that government is not the solution. It is the problem, actually. That's what Reagan said, right?
So to go back to our theme today, that I think one important legacy from May 4th movement is that Chinese intellectuals, particularly young intellectuals, should actually go to the grassroots, especially what happened in recent years in Euro-American. I think the European and American intellectuals has already keep far away from their own grassroots, and that's why we have Donald Trump. So I think at this point, particularly you mentioned about the such a large number of college graduates. I think President Xi Jinping actually urged that those young graduates should go to the grassroots, and also they have to participate in this kind of the social innovation in the recent years.
That's a very interesting point, because these days some friends of mine were debating whether elites in urban areas represent the true realities or the roadmap of China's development, or rather those from the grassroots level, ordinary folks that would represent the true picture and true image of China. Because some of the liberals said, if we were to use the ballot box and turn to the idea of one man, one vote, probably the elites would be proved wrong, because most of the ordinary folks would vote for the communist leadership of China.
Right.
So therefore, you made a very interesting point as to whether graduate students from or university graduates should be sent to the rural areas. But then we probably go back to the old memories about Cultural Revolution, when the young people were sent to the extremely poor rural areas for re-education by farmers. I mean, that's very ridiculous. It was denounced with the end of the Cultural Revolution.
That was actually a different way of thinking it. Yesterday, CCTV aired a report about Tsinghua University, as we have a tradition of almost in the past 2 decades. We send our master graduates to the rural area to become teachers.
In fact, one brilliant graduate from Yale University voluntarily went to a village to be elected a village head. And
so
he was, of course,
that's
interviewed by
probably
the
the
media.
difference between what we call the re-education, that's kind of compulsory re-education.
But it's the university graduates that, who would educate the farmers and help them get rich with technology.
I think it's no different from, say, students from Harvard University, Yale University, spend a year in Africa, for example, in South America, do some NGO work. I mean, it's no difference, I think, right? I mean, that's a way for people, for students, young students, to gain some experiences, to have an impact on society, to do some good things for.
Yeah, you know, I thought you were talking about the early days of President Obama after he graduated from Harvard Law School.
Yeah,
he went to a local community to provide public service, and he was paid poorly. However, he was so glad and so happy to serve the poor, the disadvantaged, as a brilliant lawyer from Harvard. So that might be a source of inspiration for the young university.
He's called a community organizer. I remember this.
So
community organizer.
That's exactly the May 4th tradition that we have inherited today, that Chinese intellectuals, particularly young students, has to go to the grassroots, to speak to the public, to communicate with the grassroots people. So this is actually one tradition we have to remember today.
Well, young people have been very innovative, very creative, and somehow tend to be very independent, despite the fact that most of them are the only child of a family due to the family planning policy. Do you think we should respect more of their independence to help cultivate the spirit of being critical? I mean, then a skeptical West and audiences in those countries would say, hey, your political culture would prevent people from being critical and independent.
You have to. I mean, try not to, with your kids. These days, the young kids are very independent.
Very rebellious.
And also, they don't listen to us anymore. I mean, I have a tough time trying to persuade my own kids.
I'm quite against the expectations of our skeptical Western audience. These young kids who grew up who were born in the 90s and the new millennium, proved so patriotic. And how can you explain such sort of things that the young kids who were supposed to be very critical of the reality, they are very patriotic. And some of them got educated in the United States. They came back with their idea and understanding about the American dream, and yet they turned out to be very patriotic.
I think obviously this patriotism or nationalism comes from the rise of Chinese international status, because now China is already, I think, one of the important powers in the world. But one thing we have to remember from the May 4th movement is that I think is this kind of skepticism and also challenge of authority. This is never imagined in Confucian tradition. So May 4th movement actually bring to the young intellectuals to always question authority, always to be critical of the truth. So I think this is a very important thing we should do today.
I also want to add another reason. I think information plays a very important role. Today, young people are very much well informed.
They're computer savvy.
They're computer savvy. They know what's happening around the world. They know China's status around the world.
They can't be fooled.
And they travel a lot, actually. I think this is very important. People travel a lot, especially those people who have been traveled out of China, usually become a little bit more patriotic. And these young people do. They have traveled around the world and they know what's happening around the world. And I think this information also helps contributing to a lot of people's patriotism.
For example, a couple of years back, we were talking about the 说走就走的旅行, right? They are actually at the mercy of their own whims in terms of traveling freely and independently outside this country.
Or even what we call a gap year now become a routine for many Chinese university students. They will spend a year after graduation, work or travel around the world. So I think this is also one important May 4th legacy, is that we want to learn from the other culture. Before May 4th, I think China has already think it's the central kingdom. Nobody wants to learn from the West. But after May 4th movement, I think this intellectual has the intention of learning from other culture.
An important part of Western curriculum in their tertiary education is how to encourage students to be more cosmopolitan, to be inclusive and yet at the same time critical of things and independently get that job done. What do you think of your curriculum here in the Chinese university? Both of you come from the prestigious universities in Beijing, the capital city. Well, what did you say to young students about leadership, for example? Leadership is something that the young students aspire to learn so that they can run business or they can be successful?
I think this is a very important question. I think our curriculum at university level have to be tuned to an environment that is encouraging people to seek the truth. I mean, that's the idea. You know, you seek the truth, you explore yourself. Less control from university authorities, in my opinion, is a good thing, as long as they are not, onto something bad. As long as they are, focused on exploring the world, trying to seek intellectual truth, and also, the free environment. Students and teachers, professors treating as equals, freely expressing ideas, freely exploring things, freely accessing to information. I think these are the steps that, measures that can help foster kind of good traits on our students.
Being Lei Feng is, of course, something that we are proud of for the elder generation. But I believe the iconic model for younger generation in China is Steve Jobs, who says, stay hungry, stay foolish. That may perhaps go back to what you say on the importance of curiosity in inspiring young students to seek information, new knowledge in the age of globalization. What do you think of his response?
Other than information, I think is also critical thinking. Critical thinking now become a compulsory course in many universities. And students are encouraged actually to, as Professor Ko just said, we discussed with professors. You cannot imagine your professor in your university years. You can actually change them. But now it's a routine that usually professor and student can have this face-to-face debate over certain things. So I think this is already a kind of enlightenment in many ways by May 4th movement that we can have this critical thinking.
Very quickly, gentlemen, these days something captured front page stories and headlines about the poor behavior of some students who were encouraged to do whistleblowing to supervise the behavior of the teachers in the classroom. Very quickly, do you think this is something that should be encouraged?
No, absolutely not.
Is this part of the critical spirit that the young students should have?
It's East German, it's called Stasi, okay? It's something that's not supposed to do, in my opinion.
Okay, in fact, a Weibo by Mr. Hu Xin, editor-in-chief of Global Times, also criticized vehemently this kind of poor behavior. Very quickly, your response?
I would say it's just a case in point. It's not a kind of routine. It's only also reflect kind of critical thinking in many ways, that they can criticize the professors.
Well, anyway, this is by asking this question, this is a piece of honest advice for you guys to be careful in the classroom. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.